We're waiting for a couple of people to join, right?
Yeah, I guess like in 1 minute we'll start.
Great. Let me know when to start.
Sure. Yeah, Damini, I guess now you can start.
Great. Give me a second. Can you all see me?
Yes,
Great.
yes.
Starting in starting in three, two, one. Right. So, let's go through a couple of motions. I think that'll give us a better idea of what argumentation looks like. We can also explore a couple of new aspects or under uh, talked about aspects within the meeting itself. The first motion I'd like to pick up is Tissa's beliefs feminism is in opposition to capitalism. On government, the way that this looks like is that you figure out what capitalism itself is and who made this institution, what was the purpose of making this institution in the first place. I think um, it's imperative or it's quite important to figure out that structures like capitalism or any economic structure itself has to be linked to a larger system or has to be overlapping with a larger system of affording gender minorities lesser opportunities vis-a-vis, like, for example, men in the first place. So the way that capitalism looks like, the way that you approach this motion is that you first figure out what capitalism looks like. If I were on gov, the way that I would argue this is that I think about how capitalism more often than not is a system of money making, and it's structured in a manner economically that things like, for example, uh, businesses or things like money making as an activity itself is hierarchized first within economic class and secondly within gendered class, which means that um, the way that economics has always given more importance to men as bread earners of the family means that if, for example, a man and a woman are to interview for the same job, they're i- they're far more likely to pick the man over the woman more often than not because of a lot of stereotypes that women have to grapple with, i.e., the one that we were just talking about in terms of women are more emotional and less logical. Secondly, there's a lot of stereotypes also about how women can be distracting for the workplace because more often than not, workplace are majority men. Thirdly, in terms of like how women are largely like labor disadvantage because they have the potential to become mothers and therefore they'll go on a maternity leave, so on and so forth. So like from the smallest of levels, women, even if and when they're sitting at the same job interview, are quite disadvantaged. But on a more rudimentary level, from the very conception of like a young child itself, a male child is afforded more opportunities than a like female child, which means that a man's life or a male child's life is dictated by this individual must get the best opportunities our family can afford because they're going to be a bread earner, which means that from conception they're seen as a valuable economic agent vis-a-vis a woman who is never seen as an economic agent. So itself, capitalism affords women way less opportunities than it affords men. So the way I would start with is that capitalism structured on this separate or unfortunately divisive um, gender dynamics, which means that women at all points in time are going to suffer, whether it's from the conception of being a girl child and being afforded lesser education, if at all, vis-a-vis a like male child. Secondly, women are never seen as economic agents in the first place, which means that more often than not, they're never afforded job opportunities in the first place. But thirdly, as a consequence of capitalism, the way that economies are structured and like laws and regulations with tandem with the economy structured, is that women are afforded far lesser opportunities to accrue financial wealth or accrue any sort of financial assets vis-a-vis men, which is where we can talk about things like property, how, for example, it's far harder for a single woman to find a flat to live in vis-a-vis like a single man, and so on and so forth. The second layer I would talk about is that inevitably the rise or the sustenance of capitalism depends on constructing and maintaining and reaffirming these gender divides, which means that more often than not, instead of being seen as political agents or instead of being seen as economic agents in the first place, women are always seen as property to be accrued. Which brings us back to what we were discussing about in terms of the way that women are afforded opportunities, because they're always seen as, specifically in like the Southeast Asian nations, specifically in India, they're seen as liabilities, which means that the point from which a girl child is born, either she's like a victim of female feticide or a victim of being abandoned or any of those things. And even if and when they, as a parental unit, she's raised within that family, she's always seen as a liability, which means that a father, at the point at which he realizes that he has to bring up a girl child, starts saving for her marriage because he recognizes that she's a property. So, like, capitalism is intrinsically linked with all these patriarchal hierarchies, which means that women at no point in time will ever be able to experience, like, what equality or what equity looks like, because that would mean the deconstruction of capitalism. I think the second layer of argumentation that you can run with this is that it's quite worse for other gender minorities itself, where you can lay the foundation of saying, hey, listen, within the fourth wave of the feminist movement, we started critiquing economic and political structures more in a more nuanced and more targeted manner, but we've also started realizing the inclusion of like other gendered minority and their struggles is necessary to collectivize, gain numbers, galvanize, and push for political change. Whether that means protest, whether that means like political representation, so on and so forth. Which means that then, for gendered minorities, which are not women as well, it's quite difficult for them to access all these opportunities as well, because they're also seen as not fitting the norm of what an economic agent looks like. So that's by and large what I would run on government. And the way that I would impact this is first by laying the two premises of how historically patriarchies made women into economic property and never afforded them opportunities to become like active economic agents that can accrue financial wealth and participate in economies and have opportunities to do so. Secondly, the premise of gendered minorities and how their struggles are quite exacerbated as well as a consequence of all this, which means that then the way that I would argue everything under this would be that we think that it's harmful for women uh, as long as they're part of capitalism, and we think therefore it's necessary and it's about time for us to overhaul capitalism, and therefore we think that the point at which you overhaul capitalism, women have the ability to restructure the system in a manner where it's more equitable and more representative of their interests. Which means that women now have the ability to decide what looks best for them and how to get to that point. And that can only happen when you start deconstructing a masculine structure like capitalism. That's like by and large how I would argue this case. I think on opposition, the way I would argue this case is that um, the way that the feminist movement has made strides is something that's quite important uh, in terms of the way that a handful of women, and while it's like while we recognize that it isn't that women have reached emancipation or they've reached any form of equality or equity, there have been strides that have been made, and women are increasingly making spaces within capitalism. It's essential for capitalism to be reformed and not be like opposed in a manner where you don't want to engage with it, but rather reformation is important because capitalism itself works on money and accruing wealth as a method of getting significance, and that can be quite empowering for a lot of women, because women who haven't had the opportunity to become active financial agents, the point at which we reform capitalism is the point at which we make more spaces for women to accrue wealth. The point at which that happens, um, more often than not, women are going to feel a sense of empowerment because now they don't have to be financially dependent on their parents, brothers, or husbands. For example, if they have to go out and purchase something, they don't have to ask for money, or they don't have to secretly hide money and collect it, which is like quite traditionally done in Indian societies because women aren't given agency to have money. So women end up like hiding and saving money in their like home lockers and so on and so forth. The point at which you empower women in terms of like economic mobility, which can happen under capitalism, you make it far easier for them to feel a sense of empowerment and feel like they're able to change and shift things. Which means that the point at which women are able to feel that sense of empowerment, they're far more likely to um, understand that it's in their best interests as individuals and also as a totality or gender minority to create more spaces for women to participate in economic activity. In the absence of that, there are two things that happen, which then on opposition I would argue are harms on government. Is one, the point at which you oppose capitalism, you're also opposing women, or you're also denying the opportunity to women who are actively trying to create spaces. For example, a lot of women who are perhaps single parents or the only de facto earning member in their family because they didn't get married and their parents are quite old and retired. So those women are disadvantaged. The point at which the feminist movement takes such a stance. Secondly, in absence of all this, you're not really sure how you're going to economically emancipate women, because if women aren't seen as economic agents and active economic agents, the way that women can create value for their own selves and also in society by challenging norms of hey, women can do business as well, goes away. So how then are you going to start challenging economic norms or trickle them down into like social norms and so on and so forth? I think that's by and large it. You can always nuance these arguments to what you think the debate looks like, but I think principally these are the arguments that you make. Another uh, motion that I'd like to pick is um, this house prefers the hypersexualization of men rather than the desexualization of women, which for which I think it's a little important for us to understand what sexualization of women looks like, right? Women, because they've always been seen as uh, passive pacified actors, which means that they're either property or they're objects, or they're seen as like not something that is of act of worth in the sense that they can exercise agency or individual voice. It's it's been historically a construction of women where men have ended up sexualizing them because they've been seen as objects of sexual gratification or pleasure, which means that the way then the conversation around pleasure or the conversation around sexual imagery or sexual characteristics and perspectives has happened is through the lens of men, which means that if you look at, for example, porn, as of right now, the porn industry is built on what a woman looks like or what female pleasure looks like or what female sexuality looks like through the lens of men, which means that women have not been afforded the opportunity to ever say, hey, listen, this is what my pleasure looks like. More specifically, in context to this motion, the way that women's sexuality has been, women's sexualization rather, has taken place is by objectifying women, by making them into something that should be sexually pleasing as a visual that you see, which is quite evident in, like, for example, in things like anime, you have exaggerated features of women, like they have big breasts or they have big butts, they wear skimpy clothing, they're only character plots, they never are individual characters of their own. Those are things that have been quite dominant as, like, the way that they're constructed. For example, like Jessica Rabbit, all these things are quite predominantly how women have been constructed because that's the imagination of men and what men would like for women to be perceived as. That sexualization has also led to a lot of social problems. More like the most evident ones being catcalling or women being like victim to different levels of harassment or, like, for example, physical and sexual violations and so on and so forth. That's largely what sexualization looks like. There's far more nuance to it, but briefly this is what it looks like. With respect to this motion on government, it's about the way that sexualization itself isn't the problem. The problem is who does it and how it happens, right? Which means that on a motion, and specifically on a prefers motion, semantically, on both sides, government and opposition, you're supposed to further your own constructive case, but at the same time, you also have to take down the other side's case, which means that an opposition cannot win on a counter prop. Simply, then, in this motion, the point at which you prefer the hypersexualization of men than the desexualization of women, what you also talk about is, or where you start from, is while we recognize that sexualization of women has always been done by the lens or by the perspective of men, we recognize that a lot of women have reclaimed spaces of sexual expression by being empowered by wearing, like, clothing that might be deemed objectifying, or being proud of the way that they, for example, a lot of women feel empowered when they work in the porn industry or when they work as webcam girls. So that's also sexualization, and we're okay with it because a lot of women are able to create empowerment for themselves. They feel empowered when they feel sexy. They feel empowered when they know that how they choose to express their sexual desires or their sexuality is coming from their own agency. And we think that that's a sexual revolution we would like to be part of. We think then the way you tackle the problematic way of sexualizing women can be also through hypersexualizing men, because that does two things, right? One, it it liberalizes or it opens the avenue for the conversation around sexuality or sexualization to not be gendered, which means that disproportionately women are sexualized over men, and that's something that you end up tackling the point at which you hypersexualize men, because the pressure of beauty standards or the pressure to look a certain way is far more on women than it is on men, and you end up leveling the scale in terms of um, how sexualization happens, right? Secondly, it's also about like some form of reparation, insofar as this is the sort of like the sort of experiences, the sort of like disparaging behavior that women have had to be victims of as a consequence of sexualization by men is also something that men might be at the receiving end of now. And those sorts of visceral things are necessary for men to understand the true depth or gravity of what women have been through. Which means that oftentimes, because men haven't been through the same experiences of being objectified the way that women have, men don't have the ability to truly understand how problematic, how harrowing, or how demeaning, or how taking away from power, or how victimizing this sort of situation can be. And unfortunately, because there is no other way for men to understand, mostly because they don't have much incentive to, no one would voluntarily want to give up their power and privilege in society. It's necessary for this hypersexualization to exist, because then the problems of what sexualization can do when it doesn't come from you becomes quite evident. And therefore men are also forced to introspect as a consequence of this, and we can perhaps figure out what this is and move towards solving it. I think that's what government looks like. Opposition essentially looks like talking about, we don't think that sexualizing someone, the point at which, or sexualizing an entire gender, the point at which you have been victims of unfair sexualization, is the way you solve the problem itself. Which means that what this will end up doing in terms of like taking away power is one that affirms that sexualization as a concept is okay, and that's quite unfair to both genders, but specifically to women. Because while men might now become victims or might go through the same lived experiences that women do, that doesn't mean that women will stop going through it. It just legitimizes or reaffirms that this is okay. And that's not okay for women to, like, or the feminist movement to, or in general the entire gender of women to go through, because the point at which there's legitimacy, it's far harder to challenge and break down as a structure. Which means that the conversation shouldn't be, hey listen, sexualization exists for women, so let's do it for men as well. It should be, hey listen, sexualization exists for women, it's damaging, therefore we must deconstruct it, we must break it. That's the conversation that you must have, because the way that you now force introspection is in a manner where you're saying, hey listen, we think that this is damaging consequences, irrespective of who's on the receiving end of it. Women more so because of also the baggage of patriarchy, but in general it's quite damaging for anyone to go through. Therefore we would much rather uproot the problem than distribute it to all genders and hope that a solution arises out of it. This is by and large what the conversation looks like for me, on in terms of what both cases will pan out to be on this motion. I'm by and large done. I'll be more than happy to take any questions if there's any questions now. You can unmute and ask.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, so beginning with the question, my first question is, when you talk about the whole four phases of feminism and feminist rights, don't you think, like, again, you mentioned about this, but asking specifically that lower middle class women do not started the, and in fact the very reason for which the feminist movement started way back in 1960s, the lower middle class women did not actually had any interest in that. Let's say for the matter that they had, let's say, equal say in the families for uh, as compared to that of upper middle class women, and like the equal rights and equal job opportunities that in the first phase upper class women were demanding. The lower middle class women, due to their socio-economic status, they were actually sort of forced to, and they had this right that they can work. So they did not intend to have this feminist movement in the first phase.
I think that's, look, I agree with you, but I think that's a function of the fact that they never had the ability to perhaps access institutions of education or knowledge to ever recognize their oppression in the first place. The reason why the upper middle class and the higher echelons of economic class or strata were able to rally for rights in the first place in terms of the suffrage movement was by and large because um, versus the lower economic background of the women in their society then, they had better ability, or they'd probably gotten better quality education, or they'd probably learned more in terms of perhaps completing high school education, maybe even going to college and so on and so forth. So the knowledge or intellectual base they had was far better than a working class woman who probably never even went to school. If she did, the best she did was middle school, and then she was forced to drop out. And if she did work, she worked, but if she didn't, she was married off, which is also quite reflective in the way that the feminist movement in India has panned out, because the recognition of oppression and the conversation around oppression is a function of your privilege. That is also to say that it's a function of your intellectual privilege or the knowledge base you have. If you don't know ideas, if you weren't exposed to education, or if you weren't exposed to knowledge systems, it's far harder for you to access or even recognize, hey, listen, maybe I'm oppressed, because I was never afforded the knowledge to learn about what oppression looked like, or what like all these ideas of, hey, listen, there is gender disparity looks like, which is why the suffrage movement was mostly started by privileged women because they had access to knowledge. They had access to also, interestingly enough, so Gerda Lerner talks about an idea where she says that the reason why women were also kept in oppression was because they were denied intellectual spaces, and the way that they were denied intellectual spaces, which also Virginia Woolf talks about, is that for doing intellectual activities, one requires some amount of like personal time, which means that if you want to study, you need to take out 2 hours to dedicate to studying. And that's true even as of right now, but women are never given that privacy, are never given that space, simply because like they're so consumed with, or they're so forced to be consumed with family affairs, with raising children, with being a good wife. So all these things were far more like exacerbated within the lower echelons of economic class than with the higher echelons, because rich people or like rich women had servants to do their work for them, had a cook, so on and so forth. So they were still able to take out some time apart from the fact that they were, as a function of money and privilege, they were able to access good colleges or good schools. They also had some amount of time to perhaps reflect on certain things vis-a-vis working class women, or like economically lesser privileged women who never had that space in the first place. I hope that answers your question, Vaibhav.
Yeah, I agree to that. This answers my question. Uh, Moving on to the next question, you talked about all the phases of like this feminist movement. So, like now we see that in coming around 10 to 15 years, there would be a sort of the biggest ever bubble of LGBT rights in coming 10 to 15 years across the globe. So, where do you see the trans women being a part of the feminist movement in the third wave and the fourth wave, and probably be the fifth wave that would come after, let's say, 15 to 20 years, the trans women, because biologically they are not the females. But again, they identify themselves as women.
Right, that's an interesting question. uh, I think that it's a little unfair for biological determinism to be the defining metric of what gender looks like, what identification looks like, which is interestingly enough also what the debate around the like gender identification and classification of the LGBTQ community looks like, where they reject biological determinism, mostly because biological determinism cannot be a metric. The reason is that they argue it's in itself quite like divisive and an oppressive metric, but even then it's not a clear cut binary, which means that there are individuals who are born with genitalia which doesn't conform to what they physically look like, which is a lot of individuals who are either born with both the conventional male genitalia and female genitalia, or they're individuals whose chromosomes don't ascribe to the XYXX binary, which means that itself the idea of biologically you're either male or female isn't a binary that's clear cut, and therefore you cannot use that binary to define what an individual looks like or wants to identify themselves as a consequence of that, the feminist movement, specifically the current wave of the feminist movement, has been quite welcoming of the trans community, in that they recognize and they agree to this idea of the fact that biological determinism isn't something that should be a qualifying factor for someone to qualify as a male or a female, and that binary itself is quite flawed. To that extent, then the way that women or the feminist movement rather chooses to argue or chooses to assimilate these women is by saying anyone who identifies as a woman is one that we would take under the umbrella of the feminist movement, and that's absolutely fair, because the point at which you're a gender minority, or for example the point at which someone identifies as a trans woman, they're going through two layers of oppression, which means that they're going through a layer of oppression as a consequence of them identifying as trans, and they're also going through a layer of oppression which is the consequence of identifying as a woman itself. So these layers of oppression, in terms of you don't fit the binary of being a cis man or a cis woman, and then also even if that's the case, you're still a woman and women are inferior, are two layers of oppression that they have to grapple with. There has been conversation around people who are labeled as TERFs, which is that this section of feminists who believe that trans women cannot qualify as women and therefore cannot be part of the feminist movement, because according to them biological determinism, in that the gender that you are born in is something that dictates whether you qualify as a woman or not. But increasingly, the current wave of feminism, the fourth wave of feminism, has rejected that idea and has actively condemned TERFs or individuals who reject trans women as women. An example would be whole conversation around J.K. Rowling, and how it's been quite controversial insofar as J.K. Rowling's often made comments that insinuate that she thinks that individuals who identify as trans are not women enough or don't qualify as women. Another qualifying metric that people who are anti-trans women within the feminist movement put forth is the idea of menstruation, in that if you don't menstruate you aren't a woman, and that's quite oppressive as well, because the feminist movement has also fought against essentializing your identity to your genitalia, and what this does is exactly that. It reaffirms the idea that your entire existence can be linked back to or can be essentialized or reduced to that one genitalia that you possess, and that's quite unfair because it reduces individuals to just the sort of genitalia they have, which has historically had quite damaging consequences for women, which means that because women have vaginas or have female conforming genitalia, so to speak, they were seen as just objects or just things that were supposed to uh, like carry forth lineages, deliver babies, and they were just useful for the purposes of like making babies and taking care of them. So historically, it's been not in the interest of the feminist movement to essentialize women to their genitalia. So I think in terms of what the feminist movement thinks, they do believe that trans women qualify as women just by virtue of the fact that they choose to identify as women, and as a consequence of that identification, they do go through the same discriminatory struggles that women go through across like the world. I hope that answers your question, Weber.
Yeah, like initial question is answered, but out of what you said, I have few more things to point out. Like, firstly, you gave the example of this J.K. Rowling's transphobic comments. So, don't you think that because of the fact that the comments were made by the J.K. Rowling and not someone so ordinary, prudent person or someone so normal person, that's why it triggered around a lot of debate, and trans persons came in the debate around the globe for the first time, probably at such a large scale. It's the identity of J.K. Rowling that triggered actually the debate of there exists a concept like transphobia, which is again, which like in a very recent video, a trans woman was shaved off forcefully, and ultimately what she did was she gave up to the person who was shaving her off with a razor. He shaved a trans woman, her entire he made her bald, and she gave up, but it didn't come under the scrutiny of the social activist or the so-called social activist as well, and even in the media, because again, this trans person wasn't that popular or like that.
Look, I think that's because J.K. Rowling's a public figure and a dearly beloved public figure, owing to like the whole Harry Potter franchise and the sort of like popularity she's accumulated. So naturally, as a consequence of having that many fans, or as a consequence of being a popular person, they're going to garner more attention for everything they say because there's more people following what they say. That isn't to say that transphobia did not exist before her. It did, and there have been multiple conversations about it. For example, a lot of conversation has been picked up about what the struggle of trans individuals in terms of threat to life looks like, as like for example, one of the biggest or the most poignant or the most important ones is the Stonewall riots and the participants of the Stonewall riots, or individuals who started the Stonewall riots. They were like trans people, and the sort of treatment that they had to go through post facto was something that's quite public, and it's something that's still like in conversation. There's also news about like what happens, um, there's also news about what happens in terms of like the way that trans people have to go through a lot, and they're often killed, and because of the way that they dress or the way that they conform to their identities. It isn't that there isn't conversation, but I do agree that because J.K. Rowling's a public figure, they're far more likely to garner more attention vis-a-vis like trans people who otherwise end up not getting as much attention for their oppression. I hope that answers your question. I see that the OC doesn't want me to take any more questions. I'll end it here if that's okay. Thanks for the session, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Damini. I hope there are no more questions. Yeah, so we'll end the meeting here. Thanks, Damini. Thanks for joining, and thanks, participants. We'll take break.
Thanks so much for hanging out and listening to the session.
Thank you,